Blacksmiths use anvils, but what exactly does an anvil do? And how do you use one? And does the style matter? In this video, I'm going to answer these questions so you can get blacksmithing right away. Blacksmiths have created thousands of unique, intricate objects just with using a hammer and an anvil, both of which are fairly flat. So how do blacksmiths do this? And it isn't some magical elvish power, because after all, the point of this video is so you can do it too. In order to know how to make a piece of steel do what you want it to, what you first need to know is what is it you want it to do. So before you pick up your hammer, break the process down into individual steps. Let's take a look at a J-hook, for example. There are 5 hammering operations in order to make one of these. Cutting it off, making a taper, making a scroll, bending it into a hook, flattening the head, and punching a hole. Let's break this down. You can cut it off using different methods, the most common being using a cutting hardy, but my favorite is to use a bandsaw. However, I will address these a little more towards the end of the video. First step is drawing out a taper. To do this, lay your piece on the anvil at the angle that you want it to be, and then strike it with your hammer at that same angle. And what that will do is that will create a taper that is even on both sides. You can almost think of it as if you're forging with 2 hammers. And since for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, the effect of your piece being pinched between your anvil and your hammer is actually the same as the effect of your piece being pinched between 2 hammers. In order to make the taper, we need to strike all 4 sides of our piece. Interestingly though, we only need to rotate it 90 degrees. Because if you think about it as though we're using 2 hammers, the hammer and the anvil, then by rotating the piece at 90 degrees with each strike, we know that every side of the piece will be hit with either the hammer or the anvil. It's good practice whenever drawing out a taper to do it on the far edge of your anvil face. What this does is it keeps the corner of the hammer from striking the anvil face, damaging both and potentially changing the angle of your taper. The next operation is scrolling. Scrolling is a decorative way to cap off the end of a part. For my hooks, I do a very simple scroll, which is just curling back the tip of my taper. To do this, make the point of your taper poke out across the anvil face and then tap it down just a little bit. Turn it over and then hit it back and make it into a curl shape. I will typically use a pair of scrolling pliers to make my scrolls, but I would highly recommend you also learn to do it on the anvil, as it will greatly improve your skill. The next operation is bending it into a hook. As you've probably guessed, to do this we use the horn of the anvil. Now the anvil that I have is what's called a London pattern anvil. The pattern just refers to the overall shape of the anvil. So there are London pattern anvils, German pattern anvils, Italian pattern anvils, kind of like there are sedans, SUVs, and pickup trucks. And there are some other patterns that I just haven't mentioned. Each of these patterns excels at something slightly different, but fundamentally they're the same thing and can be used pretty much interchangeably. I wouldn't recommend you spend too much time trying to determine what type of pattern you want your anvil to be early on. Just use whatever presents itself within your budget and has sharp corners. The next operation is flattening off the top of the hook where we're going to put the screw. Now, if you remember nothing else from this video, remember how to do this operation. This is something I struggled with for quite some time. What I would do is I would set the part I wanted to flatten on the anvil and I would strike it with the hammer. But because only part of the hammer was hitting the piece, it would angle the hammer and cause it to make a taper, like we discussed earlier. So the proper way to do this is to set the part you want flattened over top of the anvil and then strike with your hammer centered on the corner of the anvil. This is called striking half on and half off. If you look at it, half of your hammer is over top of the anvil and half of it is not over top of the anvil. Not only does this keep your piece from tapering, but it also gives you a definite shoulder. This is why it is so important to find an anvil that has sharp corners as opposed to really rounded ones. Now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, I clicked on a video on how to use an anvil, but you've instead taught me how to make a hook. And that is a fair point. And the reason I've done this is because the operations that you use for any project are pretty much going to be the same. So the anvil operations you use to make a hook are going to be the same as the anvil operations that you use to make a knife or a hair barrette or a fire poker. My recommendation is that early on you practice all these small anvil operations with 1/4-inch bar stock. The reason I recommend this is because it's cheap and it's quick to heat up. Now you may have noticed that in the center of my hook there is a twist. The reason I've left this out is because this doesn't actually require an anvil. This is done just by heating up your piece, putting it in a vise, and twisting it with a wrench or some pliers. This is actually really easy to pull off, and the results are fabulous. You don't even need a blacksmith's post vise to do this, because you're not striking it with a hammer, so even just a normal bench vise will work well. Having a large anvil enables the anvil to push up with the same amount of force as the hammer coming down. You're always going to lose a little bit of force that just travels through the ground. But the larger the anvil, the less force you lose. Because of this, if you had 2 anvils, a larger one and a smaller one, all of their variables the same, if you struck a piece of steel, it would actually move more on the larger anvil than it would on the smaller, because you're losing less energy through the ground. You can measure the amount that an anvil pushes back by measuring what's called the anvil's rebound. You can measure this by taking a steel ball, like a ball bearing, holding it to the 10-inch mark on a ruler and dropping it onto the anvil face, and then seeing how high up it bounces. If you dropped it from the 10-inch mark and it bounced back up to the 6-inch mark, you have a 60% rebound. If it bounced to the 7-inch mark, you have a 70% rebound. The higher the rebound, the less energy is being wasted. Now you may be wondering what these 2 holes are for. The larger one is called the hardy hole. This is used to hold tools onto your anvil, such as cutting tools and bicks. These are collectively known as hardies. The smaller hole is called the Pritchett hole. This is used for hold downs and drifting holes. London pattern anvils also have a table. This is a smaller step of softer metal so you can cut on it without damaging your tool. I do want to say that this is not a complete list of anvil techniques, but these are the ones that I use all the time. So I would encourage you to get these down pat, but never stop learning.